The days that followed Jake's reluctant decision to stand by Queen Alara felt like they were pulling him into a whirlwind. He had always thought of himself as a negotiator, someone who brought people together through dialogue. Here he was, standing on the edge of a war that wasn't his, yet would affect him more than he could possibly imagine. The Scifi fleet was growing closer, and the Zorthians were scrambling to prepare. Jake had never been a soldier, but under the Queen's orders, he found himself in war meetings with generals, strategists, and advisors. They looked at him with suspicion, even disdain, but the Queen made it clear that he was to have a seat. At the table, she trusted him, and in some strange way, he was beginning to trust her as well. It wasn't easy. The generals didn't like the idea of a human being involved in their war plans. They questioned every suggestion he made, even though they didn't have a better plan themselves. But Jake had something they didn't, a human perspective. He had an outsider's view, one that didn't follow the old ways of war that had been passed down in the Zorthian Empire for centuries. The first night Jake had spent in the war room, he had made a suggestion. It was a simple one, almost too simple for the others to take seriously. He had proposed using a decoy fleet to mislead the Scifi, drawing them into a trap. The Zorthian generals had laughed at him, but the Queen had stayed silent, her eyes locked on Jake as he explained the plan further. "You think we should mislead them?" One of the generals had sneered. "With all due respect, Captain, the Scifi are no fools. They'll see through any trick we try, but you're missing something," Jake had replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The Scifi have an ego. They think they're unbeatable. If we show them a weak point, they'll think they can attack it without any consequences. If we set up a trap, make it look like they're taking the upper hand, they'll fall right into it." The Queen had nodded slowly. "Continue, Captain." Jake had gone on, explaining how they could use their smaller, faster ships to create the illusion of a vulnerable target. By the time the Scifi realized it was a trap, it would be too late. They would be surrounded by the full force of the Zorthian fleet. It hadn't been an easy sell. But after a few tense hours of discussion, the generals had finally agreed to give it a try. The Queen had given Jake a small smile of approval, and that was enough to make him feel a little less like an outsider. Maybe he wasn't completely out of his depth. Still, there was no denying the weight of what was about to happen. The Scifi were ruthless, and they were coming with a fleet large enough to wipe out entire worlds. Zorothia was strong, but Jake knew it wasn't invincible. He had to believe in his plan, and more importantly, in himself. For the next few days, the preparations were intense. Jake found himself working closely with the fleet commanders, reviewing their tactics, making adjustments to the plan. He wasn't the one in charge of the military, but he felt a strange sense of responsibility. Every time he gave a suggestion, he could see the doubt in the general's eyes, but he pushed forward. The Queen had put her faith in him. He wasn't going to let her down. As the battle drew nearer, Jake had less and less time to reflect on what he was doing. He focused on the immediate task at hand, learning what he could about the Zorthian ships, their weaponry, their tactics. He also spent more time with the Queen, helping her coordinate the final stages of the plan. Despite the pressure of the situation, there was a strange bond growing between them. She had once been a distant, almost cold ruler, but now, in the heat of the battle, Jake saw another side of her. He saw someone who was as vulnerable as he was, someone who was willing to risk everything to protect her people. One night, as they sat in the war room, the Queen turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "Captain," she said softly, "I am not a warrior. I never wanted to be a queen in this way. I never wanted to lead my people into battle." Jake looked at her, his brow furrowing. "I don't think anyone wants war, Your Majesty. But sometimes it's unavoidable." She nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "Yes, but what I fear is that this war is not just about survival. It is about something more. If we lose, ... She didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. If they lost, the Zorthian Empire could fall, and with it, the fragile peace that had allowed them to survive for so long. "You're not alone in this," Jake said quietly. "We'll make it through together." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, Jake saw a hint of gratitude in her eyes. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. The day before the battle arrived too quickly. The Zoathian fleet had gathered at the edge of the system, ready to execute their plan. Jake stood on the command deck of the flagship watching the holographic display of the fleet's movements. His heart was pounding, his thoughts racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. The Xanthi were too powerful, too relentless. But he had to push those thoughts aside. There was no time for doubt now. "Captain Daniels," a voice said from behind him. Jake turned to see General Varys, one of the more seasoned officers, approaching. "We're ready to proceed. Your plan will be enacted as soon as we receive the signal." Jake nodded, though his stomach was tight with nerves. "Thank you, General. We've prepared as best as we can." Varys gave him a sharp look. "Still doubt it, don't you? You doubt whether we can win?" Jake didn't respond immediately. He didn't have the experience to know what it would take to win a battle of this magnitude. "I just don't want to lose," he said at last. Varys studied him for a moment, then gave a single gruff nod. "I understand. Don't forget. Captain, sometimes the difference between victory and defeat isn't just about strategy. It's about believing that you can win. If you have that belief, your people will follow you. The Queen has placed her trust in you. We all have." Jake swallowed hard. The weight of his responsibility settled on him like a heavy cloak. "I'll do my best." As the hours ticked down to the battle, Jake found himself standing alongside the Queen once again. She had come to the command deck, standing at his side as they watched the fleet prepare. Her face was calm, but Jake could see the strain in her eyes. "You're not alone in this," Jake said again, his voice steady, despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. Queen Alara didn't respond at first. She simply looked at him as if weighing his words. "I know," she said at last, "but it doesn't make the burden any lighter." Jake turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll win this. Together." She met his gaze, her expression softening for a moment before, returning to its usual resolve. "We will," she agreed. And with that, the battle began. The first wave of Xanthi ships came into view, massive warships that dwarfed the Zorathian fleet. They moved with precision, their weapons charged and ready. The decoy fleet, the one Jake had suggested, took its place at the front, drawing the Xanthi's attention. The Zorathians held back, waiting for the moment to strike. Jake watched with bated breath as the Xanthi fleet moved into position. His plan was working so far. The Xanthi had taken the bait, believing the Zorathian forces were unprepared. They moved in, eager to crush what they thought was an easy target. But as they got closer, the trap sprang shut. Zorathian ships emerged from their hidden positions, surrounding the Xanthi fleet on all sides. The Xanthi were caught off guard, their ships scattered and disorganized as they tried to regroup. The battle raged on, ships exchanging fire, explosions lighting up the darkness of space. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the battle unfold. He had never been in a fight like this before, but he couldn't afford to let fear take over. He had to keep his mind focused on the plan. As the Zorathian fleet pressed forward, the tide began to turn. Xanthi were reeling, their forces breaking apart under the coordinated assault. Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. It was working. They were winning, but even as the victory seemed within reach, Jake knew they couldn't let their guard down. The Xanthi were cunning, and they would fight to the last. The battle wasn't over yet. The days after his conversation with Queen Alara felt like a blur to Jake. The weight of her words haunted him. The realization that he had become part of something much bigger than a simple trade negotiation settling deep in his chest. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake by coming to Zorathia. What had he gotten himself into? But even as the doubts circled in his mind, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward the Queen award her empire, her people, and everything she had promised him. He spent the next several days under a watchful eye. The courtiers and advisors who had once regarded him with polite curiosity now looked at him with a mix of respect and fear. They seemed to recognize the shift in the Queen's behavior, as if her decision to bring him closer had changed his status in the palace. They weren't sure what role he was meant to play, but there was no mistaking the fact that Jake Daniels, the human diplomat, was no longer an outsider. He was something more. Jake hadn't been told exactly what his role would be, but the Queen's words still echoed in his mind. You are the key to something greater. He had assumed she meant the trade deal, but now, with the growing tension in the palace, Jake had to wonder if the stakes were much higher than anyone had let on. It was one of those late evenings when Jake's uncertainty reached its peak. He'd spent the day reviewing the latest data on Earth's potential trade benefits with the Zorathian Empire, but his mind kept wandering back to the Queen. The way she had looked at him in the gardens, the intensity in her eyes, the cryptic words she had spoken. It was like a puzzle he couldn't solve, a riddle that gnawed at him when he least expected. Captain, a familiar voice broke his thoughts. He turned to see Lieutenant Varn standing in the doorway, his tall figure blocking the entrance. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his stance that made Jake sit up. Straighter. Yes, Jake asked, his voice cautious. There's trouble, Varn said, his words clipped and urgent. The Queen has called for a meeting of the court. She wants you there now. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Trouble? What kind of trouble? Air in the room seemed to thicken, and he could sense that something significant was about to happen. He quickly rose to his feet, trying to push the unsettling feeling down. Lead the way, he said, his voice steady, despite the tension building. Inside him, the palace halls were quieter than usual as they made their way through the grand corridors. Jake could feel the eyes of the guards on him, but they said nothing, their expressions cold and distant. He tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, the unsettling sensation that something had changed in the air. Something was coming, and he didn't know if he was ready for it. When they reached the throne room, large doors were already open, and the courtiers had gathered in their usual places. The Queen sat at the far end of the room, her presence dominating the space. She didn't look like the ruler he had seen before, cold, composed, and distant. Tonight she seemed more urgent, her golden eyes scanning the room as if looking for something or someone. Jake entered the room and made his way toward the front, feeling every pair of eyes on him. The courtiers shifted uncomfortably as he took his place beside the Queen's throne. She looked at him, her gaze meeting his for a brief moment, before she turned her attention back to the assembled nobles. Captain Daniels, she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of something unspoken. You are here because the time has come for us to face the truth. The galaxy is changing, and my empire stands at a crossroads. Jake didn't know what to say. Queen's words felt like an announcement, like the beginning of something he wasn't fully prepared for. He glanced around the room at the other courtiers, their faces painted with a mix of fear, confusion, and anticipation. They seemed to know something Jake didn't. The rival empire, the Xanthi, has sent a message. The Queen continued, her voice rising slightly. They are coming. They will not stop until they have what they want. Jake's stomach tightened. The Xanthi. He had heard of them, another powerful empire in the galaxy, known for their ruthlessness and aggression. They had been enemies of the Zorathians for centuries, but things had calmed down over the years, or so Jake thought. What do they want? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They want control, the Queen replied, her tone dark. They want to break us, weaken us, and take what they believe is rightfully theirs. But what they don't realize is that they have underestimated us. They have underestimated you, Captain. Jake frowned. Underestimated me. Queen. Alara stood from her throne and walked toward him, her steps graceful but purposeful. Yes, you are the key to something far greater than anyone realizes. And now, I'm asking you to help me protect this empire. Help me stop the Xanthi. Blinked, confused. How am I supposed to help? I'm just a diplomat. I've never fought in a war. The Queen stopped in front of him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his heart race. You are more than that. You're the one who will show my people that they can fight differently, that they can adapt like humans do. You will help lead my forces, Captain. You will help us win. Jake's mouth went dry. He had never imagined this. He had never asked for it. He had come to Zorathia with the goal of opening trade relations, of fostering peace. And now, here he was, being asked to lead a war against one of the most fearsome empires in the galaxy. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, Jake stammered, his mind spinning. You are, the Queen said firmly. I've seen it in you, Captain. It's the way you think, the way you approach problems. You may not have fought in a war before, but you understand strategy. You understand what it means to survive. And that is exactly what we need. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? It was just a humana. Single man, one person who had no place in galactic politics or warfare. But the Queen was right. There was something inside of him, something that made him want to fight. He had always believed that humanity had something special. Was the moment he was meant to prove it. I'll do it, Jake said, his voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at his insides. I'll help you. The Queen's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Jake saw a flicker of something beyond the ruler she had been. There was a genuine appreciation in her eyes, a trust that felt rare. Thank you, Captain. I knew I could count on you. But as the courtiers began to murmur among themselves, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Queen's plan was more than just military strategy, was a test of everything he had ever known, and the stakes were higher than anything he could have imagined. The doors to the throne room opened, and a group of Zorathian generals entered, their faces grim. They were the ones who would be leading the battle if there was going to be a battle. But Jake could see that they weren't happy. He didn't like the idea of a human in command, even if it was under the Queen's orders. We have no time to waste, one of the generals said, his voice cold. The Xanthi fleet is moving quickly. We must prepare for war. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He had no experience with war. He didn't know the first thing about leading an army, but he had no choice now. The Queen had placed her trust in him, and if he failed, the consequences would be devastating, not just for Zorathia, but for Earth as well. I'll do whatever it takes, Jake said, his voice strong despite the uncertainty in his chest. The Queen nodded, her gaze never leaving him. Then let us begin. The fate of my empire and yours depends on what we do next. Jake didn't know what had happened, but the days following the Queen's strange invitation seemed to blur together. It was like being caught in a whirlwind one moment. He was a guest at a lavish banquet, and the next, he was being drawn deeper into the mysteries of the Zorathian Empire, its politics, and its queen. The palace was a maze, and it felt like every hallway held secrets. He was constantly surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and soldiers, all of them watching him with curiosity, suspicion, or something else he couldn't quite name. But no matter where he went or what he did, Jake found his thoughts continually drifting back to Queen Alara. He couldn't get her out of his head. It wasn't just her beauty or her power. It was something more. There was an air of command around her, a presence that was impossible to ignore. But there was also a sadness in her eyes, something hidden beneath the cold, calculated exterior. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was testing him, or that she had a purpose in mind that he hadn't yet figured out. She had made it clear that she had waited a long time for someone like him. But why? What had she seen in him that made her treat him differently from everyone else? It had been a week since their conversation in the garden, and Jake was no closer to understanding what was happening. He had tried to focus on his mission negotiating the trade deal between Earth and the Zorathian Empire, but it was hard to think straight when every interaction with the Queen felt like it held double meaning. One evening, he found himself alone in his chambers, staring out at the vast expanse of the Zorathian capital. The city was alive with lights, stretching out in all directions, like a river of stars flowing beneath his feet. He had seen it from the palace balcony countless times, but tonight it felt different. The city seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't quite understand. He turned away from the window and ran a hand through his hair. His mind was racing. There had to be an explanation for all of this. He couldn't let himself get caught up in some royal game, especially not with everything that was at stake for Earth. He needed to stay focused. But the more he tried to push the Queen from his mind, the more she seemed to invade it. Just as he was about to sit down at his desk, there was a knock at the door. He opened it, expecting a servant or one of the Palisades, but instead, he was met with a familiar face. "Captain Daniels," said Lieutenant Varn, one of the Zerothian guards who had been assigned to watch over him. Varn was a tall, imposing figure, his body covered in ornate armor that shimmered with a metallic sheen. He had been polite to Jake, but there was always a cool distance between them. "Lieutenant," Jake greeted him, stepping aside to let him in. "What's going on?" "There's been a change in the schedule, sir," Varn said. "The Queen requests your presence immediately. She wishes to speak with you." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Now." "It's late." Varn nodded, unfazed. "Yes, sir, the Queen is ... insistent." Jake hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he had learned by now that it was best to obey the Queen's orders, no matter how strange they seemed. "All right, let's go," he said, sighing. Varn led the way through the palace halls, and Jake followed in silence. The air was thick with tension, and the quiet seemed almost unnatural. It was as if the entire palace was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they walked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an underlying sense of urgency in Varn's demeanor, something that made Jake's instincts flare. Finally, they reached the Queen's private chambers. The door opened silently, revealing a dimly lit room. Queen Alara stood by a large window, her back to Jake. The faint light from outside cast a glow on her silver robes, making her appear almost ethereal. She didn't turn around when he entered, but he could feel her presence, as if the entire room was suffused with her energy. "Captain Daniels," she said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "I've been waiting for you." Jake stepped forward, trying to maintain his composure. "Your Majesty, what is this about? I wasn't expecting, I know," she interrupted. "I have something I need to discuss with you. Something important." She turned to face him then, her golden eyes locking onto his. There was an intensity in her gaze that sent a shiver down his spine. She didn't speak for a moment, as if considering how to phrase her next words. "I have watched you, Captain," she said, her tone even, but there was a weight behind it. "I've watched how you've handled yourself, how you've interacted with my court, with my people. You're different from the others." Jake swallowed hard. "Different how?" "Different in the way you think, the way you approach problems. You're not like the others who came before you. You're unpredictable. You think in ways that challenge me, that challenge everything I know." Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He had always tried to be adaptable, to find solutions that would work for everyone. But he never imagined it would draw such attention. "I'm just doing my job, Your Majesty. I'm here to help." "You are?" she said, her voice softening slightly. "But you're also here for something more." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" The Queen took a step closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "I've waited for a long time for someone like you, someone who doesn't just accept things as they are. Someone who can see beyond the surface, someone who is willing to challenge the status quo." Jake felt his heart race. He had no idea where this conversation was going, but he could feel the tension thickening in the air. "I don't understand." "Your Majesty, I've ruled this empire for centuries," she continued, her voice growing more intense. "And I've seen countless leaders come and go, but none of them were like you. None of them had your ... resilience, your ability to adapt. That's why I've brought you here, not just as a diplomat, but as something more." Jake's mind was spinning. He couldn't keep up with what she was saying. ... You brought me here because of that." She nodded slowly. "Yes, and because I believe you are the key to something greater. Something that will change the course of this empire and of the galaxy itself." Jake took a step back. "What do you mean? What are you asking me to do?" The Queen didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be searching his face for something. "I'm asking you to stand by my side," she said finally. "To be more than just a negotiator. To help me secure a future for my people, a future that doesn't end in war or destruction." Jake's mind raced. This was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He'd come to Zorathia to negotiate trade agreements, not to get tangled up in royal politics. He had never signed up to be a part of a galactic power struggle. I don't know if I can help you with that," Jake said, his voice uncertain. I'm just a human. I don't have the experience or the knowledge to lead an empire. You underestimate yourself, Captain, the Queen said, her tone suddenly softer. You have more strength in you than you realize. I see in you something that I have not seen in a long time, a willingness to challenge me, to question me. That is something rare, even among my own people. Jake didn't know how to respond. Everything was happening so fast. He had never imagined he would be standing here, talking about leadership, power, and empires. It was all too much. And yet, something about her words resonated with him. There was a part of him deep down that felt like this was where he was meant to be. That his purpose wasn't just to negotiate trade deals, but to be a part of something bigger. I don't know what to say, he muttered. You don't have to say anything yet, the Queen said with a small smile. But know this, Captain Daniels. Your future and the future of the Zerothian Empire are now intertwined. Whether you accept it or not, you are already a part of this. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was clear. His life as he had known it was never going to be the same. The days that followed Jake's strange encounter with Queen Alara felt like they belonged to someone else. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of her whispering finally lingered in his mind, like an echo he couldn't shake off. Had she meant by that? And why did it feel as though his accidental proposal had set in motion something far bigger than he could comprehend? He had come to the Zerothian Empire as a simple diplomat, hoping to secure a trade deal that would benefit humanity. But now, in the royal court, he was more like a piece in a game one whose rules were still a mystery to him. He was given no time to reflect on what had happened that night. Instead, his days were filled with more banquets, meetings, and discussions. Yet with every passing day, Jake could feel the weight of the Queen's presence pulling him closer. There was something about her magnetism, an unspoken force that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't long before Jake realized the Queen wasn't just interested in trade or diplomacy. She seemed fixated on him. During their meetings, her gaze never wavered from him. She asked questions about Earth, about human history, and about the culture that had allowed them to survive and thrive despite the odds. But it was the way she looked at Jim intently, almost as if she were studying every reaction, that made him uncomfortable. The first time she caught him off guard was during a casual conversation about human customs. Tell me, she had asked, her voice smooth and inviting, what is it that you humans value most? Jake paused, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being asked such personal questions by an alien queen. He had expected political discussions, not philosophical ones. We value family mostly, he said, fidgeting with his glass of alien wine. Survival is important, but family, our connections to each other, are what keep us going. She nodded thoughtfully, her golden eyes gleaming with interest. Oh, interesting. You fight not just for survival, but for the ones you love. Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. Yeah, that's pretty much it, he agreed. His voice trailing off, Queen Alara smiled, but there was something predatory about it. I wonder, she mused, if your species is as devoted to each other as you claim. Can you truly fight for the ones you love without fear? Without hesitation? Jake didn't have a good answer to that. He had seen humans fight wars, battle, enemies far stronger than them, and endure unimaginable pain. But in those moments, there was always something pushing them forward. A purpose. A reason. But was it really love that drove them? Or was it something else? I think we're driven by more than just love, he said finally. We fight for freedom, for the future, for a better life. The Queen's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, Jake almost thought he saw something in her eyes, something like sadness. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. As the days wore on, Jake began to learn more about the Zerothian Empire, but even more than that, he began to learn about its queen. Alara was not just a ruler, she was an enigma. She was the first in her line to rule for centuries, having ascended to the throne after the mysterious deaths of her predecessors. No one seemed to know the full story, but there were whispers in the palace. Some said it was a family curse. Others believed it was the result of Alara's cunning and ruthlessness. But Jake wasn't interested in rumors. He was interested in the woman herself, the one who had somehow managed to remain untouchable, even after everything she had endured. It was clear to him that she was not like any other ruler he had encountered. She didn't just command with her authority. Commanded with her presence, she made people listen. And when she spoke, every word felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 decisions. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations, Jake found himself walking the palace gardens. He had become accustomed to this strange flora that surrounded him, plants that hummed with energy and glowed softly in the dark. It was peaceful here, away from the hustle of the court. For a brief moment, he could almost forget he was a human on another world, embroiled in something far beyond his understanding. But his solitude didn't last long. Captain Daniels. A voice called out behind him. Jake turned to find Queen Alara standing at the edge of the garden, her silhouette outlined by the pale moonlight. She had a way of appearing unexpectedly, like she was always just a step ahead of him. He had never once seen her approach from behind. "Your Majesty," he said, giving a respectful bow, though he wasn't sure why. She had never asked for such formalities from him, and yet he couldn't help himself. "Walk with me," she said, her tone soft, yet commanding. "I find I'm in need of a distraction." Jake hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, falling in step beside her. The two walked in silence for a while, the only sound being the soft rustle of the alien plants in the breeze. "I see you've been getting along well with the court," the queen said after a long pause. Jake shrugged. "Well enough. A bit overwhelming at times, but I'm managing. Shh," he repeated, her voice laced with amusement. "You're more than managing, Captain. You're surviving." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Is that all?" She glanced at him, her golden eyes gleaming. In this world, survival is everything. Jake didn't know how to respond to that. It seemed like the kind of thing a ruler would say to maintain control, to remind people of their place. But there was something in her voice of vulnerability that made him think she wasn't just talking about survival in the literal sense. She was talking about something deeper, something more personal. They walked for a while longer, and Jake began to feel like he was being pulled into a conversation he wasn't prepared for. Finally, the queen spoke again. "You know," she said, softly, "I have waited a long time for someone like you." Jake glanced at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him fully now, her expression unreadable. "A human. You were different from the others. There is something about you. Something I can't explain. You've managed to fit into this world where others have failed." Jake swallowed. "I'm just doing my job, Your Majesty." She shook her head slowly. "No, Captain. You are not. Just doing your job. You are becoming a part of something far bigger than yourself." He felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't like the direction this conversation was taking. "I don't understand you, Will," she said cryptically. "In time, you will." Before Jake could ask her what she meant, she turned and began walking away, her long, flowing robes trailing behind her. "Come," she called over her shoulder. "The night is young, and I find I'm in the mood for company." Reluctantly, Jake followed her. He had no idea what was happening, but he couldn't seem to resist her pull. As they entered the royal palace once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfolding, a plan, a scheme, or perhaps something more personal. Whatever it was, he was caught in the middle of it. And the longer he stayed, the more certain he became that he had no way out. The queen had not just invited him here to negotiate trade deals. She had invited him for something else entirely, something far more dangerous. He just didn't know what yet. Later that night, after a long and exhausting dinner with the court, Jake found himself back in his chambers, lying awake on the soft, alien bed. His mind was racing, his thoughts a tangled mess. What had the queen meant when she said he was becoming a part of something bigger? And why had she been so insistent on spending time with him? He closed his eyes, but the image of her kept haunting him. Her smile, her gaze, the whispered words she had spoken earlier. Finally, it was an ordinary day in the grand hall of the Zerothian Empire. The sound of distant, formal music echoed through the marble corridors as the human, Captain Jake Daniels, waited nervously in the vast chamber. He had been summoned by the Queen herself, a rare and intimidating honor for someone of his rank. He was just a diplomat, after all. Never imagined he'd find himself in the royal court of an alien empire, especially not one as powerful as the Zorthians. Jake wasn't even sure how he got here. One moment, he had been on his ship, negotiating trade agreements with Zorothian officials. The next, he had been invited to the royal palace for what they called a cultural exchange. A meeting of minds between their people. That's what they told him anyway. Jake had learned to be skeptical about these things, but he couldn't refuse the invitation. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The hall was magnificent, the walls adorned with intricate carvings of ancient battles and majestic beings. Large, translucent banners hung from the ceiling, shimmering in the light, casting strange colors on the floor. Zorthians were tall, with skin that shifted between shades of silver and deep purple, and their eyes glowed a soft golden hue. Their queen, Queen Alara, was a being of incredible beauty and grace, but there was a coldness about her that could make anyone, human or alien, feel like they were standing in the presence of something far beyond their understanding. Jake was led into the grand throne room, where Queen Alara sat on her elevated throne. She was dressed in flowing robes of silver, and her crown, an elegant piece of living metal, rested lightly atop her head. Her gaze was sharp and calculating, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes as she studied him. Jake bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said, trying his best to sound confident. The Queen nodded, her eyes flicking over him. "Captain Jake Daniels of Earth, you are here at my invitation. I hope your journey was pleasant." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Jake replied. "It was an experience, to say the least. Your empire's beautiful." "Flattery will get you nowhere," she said, her voice like velvet, smooth and commanding. "But I appreciate the sentiment." Jake's nerves fluttered. He had read reports about Hertha, Queen of Zorothia, was known for her sharp intelligence, and her refusal to tolerate anything less than perfection. She had maintained her throne for centuries, despite numerous assassination attempts, political betrayals, and even wars with other empires. She was a ruler who demanded respect, and her people followed her with absolute loyalty. "So, what is it that you seek from me, Captain?" Queen Alara asked, her tone shifting to something more curious. I am here to negotiate a trade agreement," Jake stammered, feeling the weight of her gaze pressing on him. "We humans wish to establish more open relations with the Zorthian Empire. We have resources you may find useful, and we are interested in learning more about your advanced technologies." The Queen leaned forward slightly, her golden eyes narrowing. "I have heard of your species, humans. You are young, yet resilient. You have managed to survive the harshest of conditions on your planet. You are untested in the ways of the galaxy. Do you truly believe you can offer anything of value to the Zorothians?" Jake felt his pulse quicken, but he stood his ground. "We may be young, but we have faced challenges that have made us stronger. We are not like other races in the galaxy. We are adaptable, can be a useful ally to your empire."
Let us.
Lips curled into a small smile. "We shall see. But for now, I find myself curious about you, Captain Daniels. Your people have not been to our world before. I wish to learn more about you." Jake was caught off guard by the change in her tone. He had expected a long, formal discussion about trade terms, but instead, she seemed to be studying him. He wasn't sure if he was flattered or terrified. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have, Your Majesty," he said. The Queen's smile widened, and Jake couldn't help but feel a slight chill run down his spine. "I have a question for you, Captain. One that I've asked many in my time, yet no one has ever been able to answer it in a way that satisfies me." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What question is that, Your Majesty?" She leaned back in her throne, her eyes locking onto his. "Why do humans fight so fiercely for what they want? Why do you throw yourselves into battle, even when the odds are against you?" Jake hesitated. That was a question he had asked himself many times. Why did humans? Fight. Why did they risk everything, even when they knew the odds were against them? It wasn't something he could easily explain. But after a moment, he found himself speaking from the heart. "We fight because we don't know how not to," he said. Quietly, "It's in our nature. We don't give up. No matter how many times we fall, we get back up. We fight for each other. For our future, for the things we believe in." The Queen's eyes gleamed with something that might have been admiration, or perhaps something more dangerous. "Interesting. Perhaps there is more to your species than I first thought." Before Jake could respond, a sudden noise broke the tension. A soft chime sounded through the hall, and a servant hurried in, bowing low to the Queen. "My Queen, the royal banquet is prepared." The servant announced. Queen Alara nodded, her gaze shifting back to Jake. "Come, Captain. Join me for dinner. I have yet to learn the full measure of your people, and I intend to do so." Jake wasn't sure if he was being honored or if this was some kind of strange test. Either way, he wasn't about to refuse. The Queen had invited him into her court, and he wasn't about to make a fool of himself by turning down her hospitality. As they made their way to the banquet hall, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the Queen looked at him, the way she spoke. It all felt like a game one, in which he wasn't sure of the rules. The banquet hall was even grander than the throne room, with a long table stretching out before them. The room was filled with Zorothian nobles, each dressed in elaborate garments, their eyes watching Jake with a mix of curiosity and disdain. He tried to maintain his composure as he took his seat, aware of every eye on him. The Queen seated herself at the head of the table, and a hushed silence fell over the room. Jake's stomach churned with nervousness as the meal began. Strange. Alien dishes were brought before him, glowing fruits, meats that seemed to shimmer with energy, and liquids that changed color as they were poured. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to eat any of it, but the Queen's expectant gaze made him feel like he didn't have much of a choice. As the evening wore on, Jake found himself lost in the strange customs of the Zorothian court. He didn't understand the half of what was going on, but he tried to participate as best as he could. When it was his turn to speak, he managed to stammer through a few words about Earth's history, about the human struggle for survival and progress. The Queen listened intently, but her gaze never left him. There was something in her eyes, something that made Jake uneasy. He had been around enough powerful people to know when they were sizing him up. Finally, after what felt like hours, the banquet came to a close. The guests began to leave, but the Queen motioned for Jake to stay. "I have one final request of you, Captain," she said, her voice low and seductive. "Before you leave, I would like you to perform a custom of our people. It is a tradition, one that marks the beginning of a significant relationship." Jake blinked, confused. "A tradition?"
Ow.
The Queen smiled, and for the first time, Jake saw a hint of something softer in her expression. "Yes, it is a simple gesture, Captain. One that I have waited for a long time." Before he could ask what she meant, she took his hand in hers and brought it to her lips. For a moment, there was a stillness between them, and then, almost two. "Quietly to hear," she whispered finally. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what had just happened, but the words haunted him. What did she mean? Why had she said that? And why did he suddenly feel like his entire life had just been changed forever?